Did you know that in Victorian England, a husband could legally sell his wife at the market for the price of a cow? Between 1750 and 1850, over 300 documented cases exist of men dragging their wives to public squares, placing ropes around their necks and auctioning them to the highest bidder. The law not only permitted this, but protected the buyer's rights to their human purchases. We've been told Victorian marriage was the golden age of romance, where gentlemen courted ladies with flowers and poetry, where love conquered all behind white picket fences and Sunday dinners. The reality was a nightmare that would make modern horror films seem tame. Victorian wives endured horrors so brutal that many chose death over marriage. Yet history books painted pretty pictures of domestic bliss. What you're about to discover will shatter every romantic notion you've ever held about the past. Behind those elegant gowns and perfectly manicured gardens lay a system of legalized torture that destroyed millions of women's lives. The truth about Victorian marriage isn't just disturbing. It's evidence of humanity's darkest capacity for cruelty disguised as civilization. The real story begins with how these women became commodities in the first place. Victorian England operated the most sophisticated human trafficking network in history, and they called it the marriage market. Every spring, wealthy families descended upon London with their daughters in tow. Not for romance, but for the most profitable transaction of their lives. These weren't social gatherings, or livestock auctions with chandeliers. The season began with mathematical precision. Fathers calculated their daughters' worth using detailed spreadsheets that itemized everything from dowry amounts to physical attributes. A girl with 10,000 pounds and perfect teeth commanded higher prices than one with 15,000 pounds and a slight limp. Beauty was currency, but money was king. Marriage brokers operated openly, maintaining catalogs of available girls, complete with financial statements and physical descriptions. These professionals charged substantial fees for arranging matches, treating human beings like prize cattle. The most successful brokers kept detailed records of bloodlines, ensuring proper breeding between families of similar social standing. Young women as early as 14 found themselves paraded through ballrooms, while potential buyers examined their teeth, assessed their childbearing hips, and negotiated terms with their fathers. The girls themselves remained silent throughout these inspections, trained from birth that their opinions held no value in their own sale. The dowry system created a marketplace where desperate fathers sold daughters to settle debts. Court records from 1847 show cases of men trading daughters for gambling debts, business partnerships, and property disputes. One documented case involved a father who wagered his 16-year-old daughter in a card game and lost her to a man 3 times her age. Newspapers openly advertised available brides, horses, and furniture. The Morning Chronicle regularly featured matrimonial advertisements where men specified their requirements. Gentleman seeks wife with 5,000 pounds minimum, good teeth, broad hips for childbearing. Age 16, 20 preferred. Women occasionally place their own desperate advertisements. Young lady, reduced circumstances, seeks immediate marriage to gentleman of means. The most disturbing aspect was the inspection process. Potential husbands examined women like merchandise, checking for physical defects that might reduce their value. Medical examinations verified virginity, fertility potential, and absence of hereditary diseases. Women who failed these inspections faced social death, unmarriageable and burdensome to their families. Parents routinely lied about their daughters' ages, health, and dowries to secure better matches. 13-year-olds were passed off. 16. Consumptive girls were heavily powdered to hide their pallor, and fathers forged financial documents to inflate dowry amounts. These deceptions often resulted in violent confrontations when husbands discovered the truth after purchase. The system was so entrenched that even working-class families participated. Poor parents sold daughters to factory owners, ship captains, and colonial settlers, desperate for wives. Deceptions by sending their daughters into marriage completely ignorant of what awaited them. This wasn't accidental. It was deliberate torture, disguised as moral purity. The less a bride knew about marital duties, the more virtuous she was considered, creating a system where innocence became a weapon of mass destruction. Medical textbooks of the era revealed a shocking extent of this conspiracy of silence. Dr. William Acton's influential work, the functions and disorders of the reproductive organs, advised that the majority of women are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. This lie became gospel taught to generations of mothers, who used it to justify keeping daughters in dangerous ignorance. Wedding night accounts discovered in private letters and diaries described scenes of absolute terror. Brides wrote of being attacked by wild animals and experiencing torture beyond description. Many believed they were being murdered during their first sexual encounter, having no framework to understand what was happening to their bodies. The physical consequences were catastrophic. Without any preparation or knowledge of anatomy, young women suffered severe injuries during forced consummation. Medical records from Victorian hospitals show alarming numbers of new brides admitted for internal injuries, hemorrhaging, and psychological trauma within days of their weddings. Mothers actively participated in this cruelty by providing misleading or completely false information. Common advice included, "Close your eyes and think of England," or "Submit to your husband's will as you would to God's." Some mothers told daughters that marital relations would be mildly unpleasant, like taking medicine, while others claimed it happened only once for the purpose of conceiving children. The wedding night became a rite of passage through trauma. Letters between married women reveal a conspiracy of silence that extended even after marriage. Experienced wives refused to warn younger women, believing that foreknowledge would make them improper or unchaste. This created an endless cycle where each generation inflicted the same terror on the next. Religious authorities actively encouraged this ignorance, preaching that sexual knowledge would corrupt feminine purity. The Church of England distributed pamphlets warning that curious wives who sought information about marital duties were displaying unwomanly appetites that would doom their souls. The psychological damage was permanent. Many women never recovered from the shock of their wedding night, developing what doctors then termed hysterical conditions, but what we now recognize as severe trauma responses. Countless marriages began with rape, continued with terror, and ended only in death, because death was the only escape from ignorance turned into a weapon. The moment a Victorian woman spoke her wedding vows, she legally ceased to exist as a human being. This wasn't metaphorical. It was literal legal doctrine that transformed breathing women into their husbands' possessions with less legal standing than furniture or livestock. The doctrine of coverture created a system where marriage was a form of civil death for women, and the law enthusiastically enforced this annihilation. William Blackstone, whose legal commentaries shaped English law for centuries, stated unequivocally by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law, that is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. This wasn't ancient history. These laws remained in effect throughout the Victorian era, destroying millions of women's legal identities. A married woman could not own property of any kind. Everything she brought into marriage, her clothes, jewelry, inheritance, and future earnings automatically transferred to her husband. If she earned money through work, it belonged to him completely. Women who inherited family fortunes watched helplessly as their husbands squandered their ancestral wealth on gambling, mistresses, or failed business ventures. The legal system offered no protection whatsoever. Women could not sign contracts, sue anyone in court, or even make wills without their husband's written consent. They became legal ghosts, unable to engage in any transaction or legal proceeding. If a husband refused permission for his wife to sign a contract, no court would hear her complaint, because she had no legal standing to bring one. Children belonged entirely to their fathers under law. A woman had no legal claim to her own children. They were considered her husband's property manufactured by his wife for his benefit. Fathers could sell children, give them away, or will them to others without any input from mothers. Women who fled abusive marriages lost their children permanently, as courts automatically awarded custody to fathers regardless of their character or behavior. Wife-selling markets that operated throughout England epitomized this legal dehumanization. Husbands could literally sell their wives at public markets, and these transactions were legally binding. The most famous case involved a man named Henry Cook who sold his wife Mary to a farmer named William Sargent for 2 shillings and 6 pence in 1832. The local magistrate upheld the sale. Mary had no legal recourse to challenge her own purchase. Domestic violence was legally sanctioned under the rule of thumb. A husband could beat his wife with any stick no thicker than his thumb. Courts regularly dismissed assault charges against husbands, reasoning that men had the right to correct their wives' behavior. The legal system viewed wife-beating not as crime, but as household management. Women who committed adultery faced criminal prosecution, public shame, and complete loss of property and children. Men who committed adultery faced no legal consequences whatsoever. This double standard was enshrined in law. Adultery was defined as a crime only when committed by wives, never by husbands. The most sinister aspect was how the legal system presented this enslavement as protection. Lawmakers argued that coverture shielded women from the harsh realities of business and law, never acknowledging that it actually delivered them into absolute bondage. Marriage transformed independent human beings into legal property, and the Victorian legal system celebrated this transformation as civilization's greatest achievement. Victorian law contained a doctrine so horrific that modern legal systems would classify it as state-sanctioned sexual slavery. Marital rape was not only legal, but considered a husband's fundamental right. The concept of marital consent simply did not exist. Marriage was viewed as perpetual sexual consent, given once at the altar, and never retractable until death. Legal authorities explicitly codified this horror. Sir Matthew Hale's influential legal treatise, widely cited throughout the Victorian era, declared that the husband can not be guilty of a rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract, the wife hath given up herself in this kind unto her husband, which she cannot retract. This doctrine remained English law until 1991. The marriage contract was interpreted as a sexual slavery agreement. Women signed away their bodily autonomy permanently with no legal means of refusal regardless of circumstances. Husbands could force sexual intercourse during illness, pregnancy complications, or immediately after childbirth, without any legal consequences. Medical records from the era document women dying from infections caused by forced intercourse during medical recovery periods. Religious authorities enthusiastically supported this system. The Church of England taught that wives who refused their husbands' sexual demands were committing sins equivalent to adultery. Sermons regularly reminded women that their bodies belonged to their husbands, as ordained by God, and that resistance to sexual demands would result in eternal damnation. Pregnancy became a weapon of control and punishment. Without any form of birth control, women faced continuous pregnancy cycles that often ended in death. Victorian women typically endured 8-15 pregnancies during their fertile years, with maternal mortality rates exceeding 50% in some regions. Husbands used pregnancy to maintain control. Exhausted, physically debilitated women could not resist or escape. The medical establishment collaborated in this sexual enslavement. Doctors advised husbands that regular sexual access to wives was necessary for men's health while simultaneously teaching that women had no sexual needs or desires. Medical textbooks claimed that women who enjoyed sexual intercourse were mentally ill, requiring treatment to suppress their unnatural appetites. Court records reveal the absolute legal helplessness of Victorian wives. In documented cases where women sought legal protection from sexual violence, judges dismissed their complaints entirely. One 1845 case involved a woman whose husband regularly forced himself on her immediately after violent beatings. The court ruled that this was within the bounds of lawful matrimony and offered no remedy. The silence surrounding this horror was enforced through shame and social ostracism. Women who spoke about sexual violence within marriage were labeled as mentally unstable or morally corrupt. Society taught women that their suffering was both deserved and necessary, the price of respectability and social acceptance. Marriage had become a legal framework for sexual slavery, where the bedroom became a prison cell, and the wedding ring became shackles that could never be removed. While Victorian society preached moral purity, a deadly epidemic ravaged respectable households through the most twisted hypocrisy ever recorded. Husbands routinely visited brothel and brought home syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted diseases to their innocent wives, creating a silent genocide that killed thousands of women and children. While doctors and society conspired to hide the truth, medical records from London hospitals reveal the staggering scope of this hidden plague. Between 1840 and 1870, over 60% of married women treated for female complaints were actually suffering from sexually transmitted diseases contracted from their husbands. These women died slow, agonizing deaths, while being told they suffered from nervous disorders or constitutional weakness. The medical conspiracy was systematic and deliberate. Dr. Jonathan Hutchinson, prominent Victorian physician, documented how doctors routinely lied to wives about their conditions to protect husbands' reputations. When women presented with syphilis symptoms, doctors diagnosed hysteria or female weakness, while secretly treating the husbands who had infected them. This deception sentenced women to death through deliberate medical malpractice. Pregnancy became a death sentence for infected women. Syphilis caused horrific miscarriages, stillbirths, and deformed babies who died in agony within days of birth. Hospital records show that 30% of infant deaths in major cities were attributed to congenital syphilis. Yet, families were told their babies died from natural causes or God's will. The most barbaric myth of the era claimed that sex with a virgin could cure venereal disease. This lie, promoted by both folk belief and some medical practitioners, led to the systematic rape of children. Police records document hundreds of cases where infected men assaulted girls as young as 8 years old, believing this would cleanse their disease. Courts rarely prosecuted these crimes, accepting medical treatment as legitimate defense. Children born to infected parents faced unspeakable suffering. Congenital syphilis caused blindness, deafness, bone deformities, and mental disabilities. These children were often hidden away in institutions or left to die, their existence erased from family records. The disease destroyed entire family lines, while society maintained the fiction that moral families remained pure. Women had no protection from this medical terrorism. They could not refuse sexual intercourse from infected husbands, could not demand medical information about their own conditions, and could not seek treatment without their husband's permission. The medical establishment treated women's suffering as collateral damage in protecting male reputation and privilege. The statistical reality was genocide through sexual violence. Conservative estimates suggest that over 100,000 Victorian women died from sexually transmitted diseases contracted through marital rape. Countless more suffered lifelong disability, chronic pain, and psychological trauma while being gaslit by the very doctors who could have saved them. The double standard was absolutely lethal. Prostitutes were blamed and criminalized for spreading disease, while the married men who infected both prostitutes and wives faced no consequences. Society created a system where male sexual privilege literally killed women and children, and covered up the evidence to preserve respectability. This wasn't just medical negligence. It was deliberate murder by proxy, where Victorian morality became a weapon that destroyed innocent lives while protecting the guilty perpetrators who wielded it. Victorian homes harbored more violence than medieval battlefields. Yet society treated domestic brutality as a private family matter requiring no intervention. The doctrine of reasonable chastisement gave husbands legal permission to beat their wives into submission, while the law actively prevented women from seeking help or protection from their tormentors. Legal precedent explicitly protected violent husbands. The rule of thumb allowed men to beat their wives with any stick no thicker than their thumb. But court records show judges routinely dismissed cases involving much more severe violence. In 1853, Judge Cridge ruled that a husband has the right to confine his wife and beat her moderately, establishing legal doctrine that normalized extreme domestic violence. Police officers were instructed not to interfere in domestic disputes unless murder seemed imminent. The Metropolitan Police Handbook of 1856 explicitly stated that household discipline is not within our jurisdiction unless death results. This policy condemned thousands of women to live with violent predators, while society's protectors stood by and watched. The violence was systematic and horrific. Hospital records document wives admitted with broken bones, severe burns, and internal injuries that doctors privately attributed to domestic violence, but publicly diagnosed as accidents. Women arrived with teeth knocked out, eyes blackened beyond recognition, and injuries consistent with torture. Yet medical professionals routinely falsified records to protect abusive husbands. Neighbors and family members participated in this conspiracy of silence. Victorian social codes demanded that domestic matters remain private even when screams echoed through walls nightly. Community members who witnessed violence were expected to ignore it, while women who sought help were shamed for airing private business and bringing scandal to their families. The most sinister aspect was how society blamed victims for their own abuse. Religious leaders preached that women who suffered domestic violence must have provoked their husbands through disobedience or moral failing. Popular literature suggested that good wives never experienced violence because they submitted properly to male authority, implying that beaten women deserve their fate. Children witnessed and experienced this violence with no protection whatsoever. Fathers had absolute legal authority over their children, meaning they could beat them as severely as they beat their wives. Many children grew up in homes where violence was the primary form of communication, creating generations of trauma that passed from parent to child. Killing was often the only escape, but even then, justice remained elusive. Court records show that when abusive husbands killed their wives, judges frequently sentenced them to minimal prison terms. Accepting provocation or temporary insanity as mitigating factors, women who killed their abusers faced execution, as the law viewed their actions as rebellion against natural male authority rather than self-defense. Victorian domesticity was built on a foundation of legalized terrorism, where homes became torture chambers and marriage certificates became hunting licenses for predators, who faced no consequences for destroying the women trapped within their power. Victorian women lived in a legal prison with no possibility of parole, where divorce was so expensive and complicated that only the wealthiest aristocrats could afford freedom for marriage. The system deliberately trapped women in abusive relationships by making escape financially impossible and socially suicidal, ensuring that wives remained captive regardless of their suffering. Before 1857, divorce required a private act of parliament costing over £1,000, equivalent to $100,000 today. Only the ultra-wealthy could afford this process, which involved hiring lawyers, bribing politicians, and enduring public hearings where intimate details were broadcast to the entire nation. Between 1700 and 1857, only 324 divorces were granted in all of England, and just 4 were petitioned by women. The legal system struggled to prosecute these cases because the evidence often revealed that poison. Defense lawyers regularly presented evidence of brutal beatings, sexual assault, and psychological torture, forcing courts to confront the reality that marriage had become a form of sanctioned abuse that drove women to desperate measures. Underground networks developed to help abused women obtain poisons and plan their husbands' deaths. The Victorian poisoner represented the ultimate rebellion against a system designed to destroy women. When law, religion, and society offered no protection, these women chose to protect themselves through the only means available, transforming victimhood into vengeance and helplessness into deadly power. The statistics tell a story of systematic genocide disguised as domestic bliss. Victorian women died an average of 15 years younger than men, with maternal mortality rates reaching 50% in industrial cities. Over 2 million women died in childbirth during the Victorian era. Deaths that were preventable but for the legal and medical systems that treated women as expendable breeding stock rather than human beings deserving protection. Hospital records reveal that domestic violence killed more Victorian women than cholera, tuberculosis, and industrial accidents combined, yet these deaths were classified as accidents or natural causes, erasing evidence of the Holocaust occurring within marriage. The true casualty count of Victorian domesticity will never be known because the system deliberately concealed its victims. The economic analysis is equally devastating. Victorian women contributed billions of pounds worth of unpaid labor through domestic work, childcare, and textile production, yet owned nothing and earned nothing in their own right. This represented the largest theft in human history, an entire gender's economic productivity stolen through legal framework and religious justification. The psychological legacy persisted for generations. Children raised in homes governed by coverture laws, domestic violence, and female subjugation carried these patterns into the 20th century. The Victorian model of marriage created trauma that echoed through families for decades, normalizing abuse and teaching each generation that women's suffering was natural and necessary. Modern marriage. Equality movements continue fighting battles against Victorian-era assumptions about gender roles, domestic authority, and women's rights within relationships. The legal principles that once made women property have evolved, but not disappeared, manifesting in contemporary struggles over reproductive rights. domestic violence, prosecution, and economic equality within marriage. The darkest secret of Victorian marriage wasn't any single horror, but the systematic nature of women's destruction. Carefully constructed through law, medicine, religion, and social custom to ensure that half the population lived as slaves. While society celebrated their enslavement as moral virtue and domestic perfection,